is about being oppressed some 60, 70 years. The protests are just the anger that has exploded. That is how a young Palestinian has described what we are seeing play out across occupied Palestine on the streets as youth make a stand against a long-standing Israeli policy of occupation, demolition, killing, detention, and restrictions on religious freedoms. Young Palestinians say that this uprising is just the tip of the iceberg, which is in fact an outward expression of an internal intifada which has been raging for years. In this edition of the debate, we discuss the Palestinian Day of Rage against the Israeli regime.
The Day of Rage against Israel. Anger simmering across the Gaza Strip and the occupied territories nearly 7 decades after the creation of Israel and the mass displacement of Palestinians. Israel's heightened aggression and violation of Palestinian rights drew protesters into the streets across the occupied West Bank and the besieged Gaza Strip following the Friday prayers, an event organized by Hamas resistance movement. The demonstrations, however, turned ugly as Israeli forces shot tear gas and live bullets to disperse the protesters in various parts of the occupied territories and Gaza. Tensions are running high across the occupied Palestinian territories as Israeli forces and Palestinians are engaged in attacks and counterattacks. And true to form, the clashes are disproportionately killing defenseless Palestinians. With tensions showing no sign of abating, Tel Aviv has deployed more than 3,500 policemen around the old city where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is located. The deployment comes as part of a newly approved measures which will allow troops to surround Palestinian neighborhoods in the occupied East Jerusalem Al-Quds.
The Intifada, or the Palestinian uprising and resistance, has been going on for decades. The world has ignored it, and then it suddenly rises up when Israel pushes just that bit too far for Palestinians to say, we can't just sit in our houses anymore. We can't just sit and queue at these checkpoints. No matter what you're going to throw at us. The F-16s, the bombings, the live bullets that are currently greeting the protesters in the streets, the enormous amount of injuries that have taken place, hundreds in the last couple of weeks. They are saying, that's not going to make us fearful of standing up to you. That's not going to stop us being in the streets and opposing this horrific framework of control and subjugation.
Meanwhile, in Tehran, thousands of Iranian people have rallied in a show of solidarity with Palestinians. They condemn the ongoing violations in the occupied territories, calling for an end to Israeli brutality. A similar rally was held in Jordan, where protesters demanded that the officials sever ties with Israel.
Al-Aqsa is a line of blood, and not just a red line. Our people support the Intifada, which we hope, God willing, that the Palestinian people who've proven over the years that despite their bombardment, they're the talk of the world. And despite being without arms, they're able to stab the heart of the Zionist entity. It's impossible to be silent with what's going on in Palestine and Al-Aqsa.
Anger has been boiling among Palestinians since early October when Israel announced plans to change the status quo at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of Muslims' holiest sites. An international outcry over the issue seems to have the least impact on Tel Aviv, which is seeking to drive Palestinians out of their own land in an attempt to expedite the process of Judaizing the occupied Palestinian lands.
Let me now introduce our guests for this edition of the debate. We're joined by journalist and Middle East expert, Ms. Hafsa Kara Mustafa, who's joining us live now from London. And we're also joined by political commentator, Mr. Jihad Morakadeh, who is joining us live from Beirut. Thank you both for joining us for this edition of the debate. Mr. Morakadeh, I'd like to start with you. A lack of leadership, that is how many criticize this uprising, but many say this void is because of a policy on the part of Israel and the Palestinian Authority to systematically remove anyone who might challenge the status quo. Does that mean, do you think that they would succeed in this regard and just let youth, for example, vent their anger?
It is a very difficult question. Basically, the Palestinians have had a lack of leadership ever since there was a split between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. what is happening on the ground, in my opinion, is extremely important, but it is, I would say it's difficult for the youth who are demonstrating in the streets to achieve anything except just vent their anger in the absence of real leadership. And the real leadership comes, in my opinion, from the junction of Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. In this respect, the Palestinian Authority is caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, they are supposed to be the negotiating partner of Israel. On the other hand, they are supposed to take care of the rights, the rightful rights of the Palestinians. So they are caught between a rock and a hard place, and Hamas does not make things easier.
Okay, Ms. Kara Mustafa, I'm wondering, what is your opinion on this void of leadership that many people speak about, as Mr. Morikada did as well?
Well, there are two separate issues here. On the one hand, you have the leadership, the Palestinian political leadership, which is in disarray, and I would agree with my co-panelists that that is a major problem to advance the Palestinian cause. But of course, this is just but on the ground in Palestine, this is an expression of rage from the people. They have been let down by almost everybody, including, of course, their leadership, but of course, the international community and all those who've promised them some sort of help to alleviate their suffering. That isn't coming forward, and as a result, they've taken matters in their own hands in the most basic of manner by simply attacking randomly anyone that symbolizes their oppression and their occupation, and this is what is happening. Having said that, I would need to put just a slight dampener on things. I think that we need to remember that Israel was founded on myths and on lies and on propaganda, and in that respect I would even actually question the number of victims, of Israeli victims, because of course we're being told that Palestinians are randomly stabbing Israelis, but of course I would question that figure. When you look at the number of Palestinians who were killed, you'd have at least 39 so far, and for Israelis, I think it begs the question of whether this idea that Palestinians are just randomly going out and attacking Israelis is entirely true. I think throughout the history of occupied Palestine, we've seen Israelis actually constantly looking for excuses, fabricating, in fact, excuses in order to go ahead and carry out either massacres with planes, with F-16s, or in this case, with the police gunning down day in, day out Palestinian men, women, and even children, and then watching them bleed to death.
Mr. Morikada, you know, there's been much argument in the media about what to call this uprising. Many people calling it straight out intifada, many people waiting and seeing what will happen. Where do you think this is at this point? Is this an intifada?
It is too early to tell. I would agree with the people who think it is too early to tell. It is just a manifestation of anger at this point. But what I think is going to happen with the burning of Joseph's tomb today, I think the Israelis are going to have a much harsher reaction. And this harsh reaction is, chances are, is going to lead to more violence on behalf of the Palestinians, and it is this violence that could develop into another intifada, because Mahmoud Abbas will not be able to keep things under wraps anymore, particularly if the Israelis react harshly. Now, there is a meeting between Foreign Secretary Kerry and Prime Minister Netanyahu in Berlin next week in order to calm things down. But if Netanyahu does not listen, does not calm things down, it could develop into an intifada.
Right, and Ms. Kara Mustafa, I found it interesting, this discussion about intifada, because in many ways I find it a bit distracting from the actual issues. Do you think the term is that important, really, at this point?
Absolutely, I agree. I think a lot of people are focusing on the labeling that we need to put to this anger and to this reaction from Palestinians. But of course, it simply really boils down to a group of people, to a population that is suffering and therefore can no longer tolerate this level of oppression and suffering. Whether you call it intifada, whether you call it a day of rage, really becomes irrelevant. But of course, everything to do with Palestine has become about sloganeering, and finding labels to associate. You know, maybe this is a third intifada, in which case it might even be a week-long intifada. What does an intifada mean other than some sort of uprising, which obviously this is? This is an expression of rage. It's a justifiable expression, given the level of oppression, given the number of attacks the Palestinians are suffering day in, day out at the hands of Jewish extremist settlers who are not only attacking them daily, but are acting in total impunity with often the support of Israeli soldiers. So it's come to a point whereby the Palestinians have realized that really, regardless of what they do, whether they stay inactive or whether they react, it doesn't matter. So might as well, if anything, die with dignity and actually attack those who are attacking you. And I think this is pretty much how we can label this situation, which is simply that the people of Palestine are reacting to their ongoing oppression.
Okay, our viewers have also been taking part in this discussion about this. Mr. Morkad, I'll just get back to you. I do apologize for interrupting you. I just want to get to our viewer comments as they've been posting on our social media pages, and we'll be right back with our guests after that.
I wish the Palestinians had bombs to defeat the Israelis. The Palestinians started all this themselves, and it keeps backfiring on them. Yes, give the Palestinians guns and bombs. Let it be an equal war. I'm humbled by the Palestinian people's dignity and resilience. This ongoing tragedy is the full responsibility of the occupying entity in their land. Some good has come out from their unspeakable sacrifice and suffering. The majority of decent humankind has understood that the so-called State of Israel is a terrorist threat to humanity. Let the world open its eyes to Israelis' atrocities. Whatever it takes, let it.